Hi, this is Professor Cahan. Welcome to History 1301, United States History to 1877. This is Lecture 3, The Age of Shakespeare. The reason it's entitled The Age of Shakespeare is the era in which the British began colonizing in the Americas happened during the same time that William Shakespeare was alive. So historians have agreed, along with literature professors, that this era is the age of Shakespeare. But I think there's something interesting here about this, that it took nearly 100 years after Columbus discovered the New World, quote unquote, for the English to actually begin to even think about attempting any sort of colonization. Now, since a lot of people look at the English society and the British government as our intellectual, our cultural, and economic ancestors, it's worth taking a few minutes to look at what England was like during this period. And what we're going to find out is that during the Age of Shakespeare, there's not very much that's similar between the United States of today and the Shakespearean era. Now, the reason I mention this is at some point in your studies, be it at Houston Community College, at Lone Star College, or if you go on to a four-year institution and take classes there, one of the things you're going to take is a literature class that is going to give you at least some introduction to the works of William Shakespeare. And your professor, a very well-meaning professor, will tell you that Shakespeare speaks to the modern era because Shakespeare was just like us. They're very fond of explaining how Shakespeare was the first modern man. And historians take a little bit of a different view on that. We don't look at William Shakespeare as being particularly similar to us. Because a lot of what was going on in Shakespearean times were totally different than ours. For example, during Shakespeare's time, virtually no one ate meat in the winter time. There was very little of a way to preserve that meat. England in the 16th century and into the 17th century was a poor, second-rate, underdeveloped country. If it existed today in those conditions, we would describe England as being a third world country. These people ate no potatoes during this era. They ate very few vegetables. They drank no tea. They didn't drink coffee. They didn't drink gin. They didn't drink port. They ate with their hands. And when I say with their hands, I don't mean they put a fork in their hands and ate like that. I mean they literally ate with their hands. They drank from communal bowls and communal goblets. So they kind of just passed it back and forth from one person to the next. They did not have separate utensils or even separate plates for one another. People during this era took no baths. They didn't have hot or cold running water during this era in England. Now, sometimes students ask questions about, well, why would they have hot and cold running water? How could they have hot and cold running water? The reality is that hot and cold running water was possible courtesy of a system of aqueducts that the Romans had actually established when they conquered these areas. The Romans were able to have hot and cold running water, and by virtue of these aqueducts, the English should have as well. However, these things had fallen into disrepair, and the English just didn't use these things. They didn't use the aqueducts properly. Very few of them had handkerchiefs to blow their nose. They didn't have portraits. They had virtually no idea what they actually looked like. A person didn't have much of an idea of what they looked like well into their lives because they didn't have mirrors. And as we're going to see, it's probably a pretty good thing that they didn't have an idea of what they looked like. These people didn't have linens. They didn't have pants. They didn't wear pants, excuse me. They didn't have the modern arrangement of meals. So in short, they were very dissimilar to us in the modern era. Their lives did not look very much like ours. Shakespeare lived in an era where witches were burned at the stake, heretics were put to death, and political prisoners were tortured, often until death. So not very much like us. And I want to take a quick detour here for a second to mention that when I'm saying the English did this or they didn't do this, I want to make it clear that we're talking about the average English person here. The life of the average English person was obviously different from the nobility in England, obviously very different from people who were the royal family. Their ability to eat meat in the winter, for example, was totally different. Their ability to drink coffee or tea or things like that, again, totally different than the average English person. So here, with this list of things on the board, we're talking specifically about the average English person during this era. The population in England was an incredibly small population. The population was about 3 million people in 1600, which means that in terms of population growth, there was no actual population growth from the founding of England in 1066 until 1600. It was simply a sort of steady line. However, as I pointed out in a previous lecture, there were always spikes in that steady line, but no permanent, sustainable growth in the population. The largest cities in England had fewer than 10,000 people, with the sole exception of London, England. London had a population of about 300,000 during that period, but it was by far the largest city. No one else even came, or no other cities actually even came close. The overwhelming majority of people in Shakespeare's time lived on farms or in villages that made up small towns. So they're simply not an urban population during this particular era. Even a century after Shakespeare died, this would put us into the mid to late 1700s. Even at that point, the majority of people in England lived on farms in small villages. So it's simply not an urban population. 80% of English people lived in rural areas. The population was also an incredibly poor, impoverished population. More than half of these people consumed more than they earned. What that means is that more than half of them were actually in debt that they simply were going to be unable to pay off at any point in their life. They suffered from chronic unemployment. What we mean by this, by chronic unemployment, is not that somebody's unemployed for a short term or somebody's unemployed for a period, like maybe somebody in the modern era runs on tough times and is unemployed for 11 months, for a year and a half. That's long-term unemployment. But chronic unemployment means that the majority of people are unemployed, and the majority of people are unemployed for a much longer period of time. They don't have the ability to go out and find jobs and change that circumstance. This society was overwhelmingly agricultural, meaning that most people in the society were farmers, but the overwhelming majority owned no land in England. The wealthiest 5% in England earned more than the poorest 50% combined. So this is not just a matter of, from an economic standpoint, that wages and wealth trended upward. Wages and wealth flowed upwards in overwhelming amounts. Now, somehow, this incredibly impoverished society, it's overwhelmingly rural, that does not have access to capital, that doesn't own land, somehow, according to our English professors, they produced literary giants. And I say, according to our English professors, they did this. It's actual truth. They did. English society produced literary giants like William Shakespeare and Sir Francis Bacon, philosophical giants like Sir John Locke, the guy who created the concept of natural rights. So when we juxtapose this impoverished rural society that doesn't actually own land and say, well, how were they able to create giants like these types of people? It creates this conundrum. And the answer here is actually very simple. There was a very highly educated elite within England during this period. And these three men, Bacon, Locke, and Shakespeare, were among that educated elite. But the average person in England simply did not fall into the same category as these three. 2/3 of adult males in England during this period not only couldn't write their names, they didn't recognize their names. If somebody wrote their name in front of them or wrote 4 names and said, pick out your name, they didn't even recognize their own name. So to call these people illiterate is kind of putting it mildly. Their lives, the way they lived their lives, according to one author of the period, their lives were, quote, nasty, short, and brutish. Nasty, short, and brutish. Nasty shouldn't need tons of explanation. It's just, things were ugly. It was short, meaning these people didn't live very long, and brutish. Life was animal. There was an animal-like existence in store for most people. We don't have a ton of census information about the average English person. What we do have is a lot of census data for the aristocracy. So in some of this stuff I'm going to be talking about here, we are going to be talking about the elites as opposed to the average everyday citizen. But in discussing these things, think about how, if this is the circumstance for the aristocracy, the wealthiest people in England, imagine what things are like for the rank and file. Imagine how devastating their lives actually are. For example, the life expectancy, again, among the aristocracy was 29 years. Life expectancy was 29 years. That is an incredibly low lifespan. Even for this era, it's on the low side. To give you an idea, Christopher Columbus, when he discovered the Americas, quote unquote, he was 41 at that time. Now, 41 was considered to be old, but Columbus was way older than this life expectancy. So this is a very low life expectancy. Far more people died before the age of 30 than lived past the age of 30. Among the children of the aristocracy, again, the wealthiest people in society, 1/3 of their children died before the age of 5. So again, imagine if this is the wealthiest people in society, imagine how bad it is for the poorest people in society. Their life expectancy had to have been lower. Their infant mortality rate had to be lower. In London, if we look at the era of the plague, the bubonic plague in London, 36% of the people there died by the age of 5. 36% died by the age of 5, excuse me, and 60% died by the age of 16, because they were those young people were the ones who were most likely to die, courtesy of things like bubonic plague. So in London, we actually have pretty good records, but for the nation as a whole, we don't. So these numbers are startling to look at. Excuse me. So it's, again, a society that's pretty much anything but, quote, like ours. This is a society that depended on the fate of their harvest. They needed crops to come in every year. If their crops don't come in, there's going to be trouble. And these people had endemic crop failures. 1/6 of every crop failed during Shakespeare's lifetime. They struggled with this stuff. Because of this, because of their struggles with agricultural goods, because of the diets that they actually ate, which was heavy on cereal grains and heavy on things like radishes and turnips, these people had a diet that was incredibly low in vitamin A and vitamin D. They had very little iron. If you remember, very few people actually ate meat during the winter. And even when they could actually eat meat, they didn't have access to lots of it. So these people had diets with low iron levels, and they had all of the associated defects with a diet that is low in vitamin A and D, low in iron. So they had chronic eye problems. These people developed bone disorders like rickets. They developed iron deficiencies and anemia. They suffered from things like tuberculosis. They suffered from urinary tract infections. And because of this stuff, because they had this whole laundry list of things that they suffered from, their immune systems were constantly compromised, which meant that if you have this large population of people who is immunocompromised, they're also going to be susceptible to epidemics. If a disease hits the population just right, it's going to just fly through that population. And England has that problem. They have a big problem with runaway epidemics. Among the worst epidemics were things like smallpox, which left people's faces scarred. At least 25% of the population were, according to one writer, quote, mutilated by smallpox. Thousands of people also, during Shakespeare's time, thousands of people died from typhus, typhoid fever. They died from flu. They died from dysentery. These epidemics, including smallpox, simply ran wild through these populations. But by far, the biggest epidemic problem that people faced in Shakespeare's England was the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, as it was called during this era. It simply ran like wildfire through the English populace. It's worth pointing out here that in this particular era, the late 16th century and the early 17th century, the rest of the world had largely figured out how to deal with smallpox and how to get rid of it in society. Bubonic plague was something that ravaged countries like Italy and ravaged places like Spain. They did this in the 1400s, and they figured out how to get rid of it. So this kind of gives you an idea of how backward England is, that in the late 1500s and early 1600s, they're still fighting it. In an era of 150 years, 1515 to 1665, England was free of the bubonic plague for a grand total of 12 years. There were only 12 years in that period where England could say, we don't have a problem with the bubonic plague. So it's a really huge issue. Now, to give you an idea, again, tying this to Shakespearean times, the reason we set it at 1515 to 1665 is this encompasses an era that begins before William Shakespeare's life and then ends after Shakespeare's life. But 1603 is the year that Hamlet actually came out. So this is a year that a lot of people point to in English culture and say, here's a standout moment. So in that year of 1603, 36,000 people died from the bubonic plague in London alone. Now, if you remember a couple of slides back, I gave the population of London's total. It was approximately 300. This means more than 10% of the population of London actually died from bubonic plague in this particular year, 1603. In 1620, 1/6 of the population of London died from bubonic plague. So it was, again, it was getting worse, not better, by 1620. And then if we look at 1665, the last point in this 150-year period, 68,000 people in London died of the bubonic plague. So not only is it getting worse, the numbers of people who are dying from it literally are doubling throughout this period. So these people are suffering, and they are suffering badly. Now, the question on many people's minds would be, who do you turn to with this sort of stuff? If society seems to be falling apart, if you've got runaway epidemics and nobody seems to be able to solve them, if the whole populace is overwhelmingly poor and doesn't own land, who is going to help society change? And many people might think doctors, many people might think the government, many people might think, if we were talking about the modern era, we'd talk about the CDC. But here, people did not turn to doctors. Doctors during Shakespeare's time were considered to be of very little use. Doctors were, generally speaking, considered to be incapable of diagnosing, let alone treating, most of the diseases that they encountered. If a person got sick, the typical medical treatment for virtually any ailment was bloodletting, meaning these doctors would attach leeches to the afflicted's body, and the leeches would suck blood out of these people's body. Over the course of bloodletting, a person could lose about 1/6 of their body's total blood volume. Okay, this is going to create a very sick person in a very quick time. Uh, and the reason they're bleeding these people out like this, the reason they're doing this, is because the doctors of this era were trained almost exactly the same way doctors were trained during the Greek period of history, the Hellenic period. And I'm going to move a slide ahead for a second, but we're going to come back to this slide in just a second. But to give you an idea of how doctors actually approached the body, they understood the body in the same way the Greeks understood the body, in terms of what are called humors. Okay? The belief here was that the body had four elements that had to be in balance. And if those elements were out of balance, then that's what caused people to be sick. It wasn't a disease that had somehow infected them. It wasn't because they caught a cold. It wasn't because things didn't happen because they ate the wrong sorts of things. It was a matter of the elements within the body being out of balance, quote unquote. And the best way to balance them, the quickest way to balance them, was to take blood out of the body. Now, the quote unquote humors, as they were called, were yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. And all of these things had a corresponding element within nature and a corresponding season within nature. So you can see on the chart here that's on the board, people who had a yellow bile imbalance, for example, were what people would call choleric. They had a choleric temper, meaning that they were chronically angry or easily angered. And think about if any of you have children, your children might have gone through a period of having colic or something like that. And these people, if you think of a child with colic, all they do is cry all the time. So it seems like they're angry or they're easily upset. And the thought was, people get easily angered. People have this fiery temper, if you will, because they have fire in the body. And that sort of time was associated with the summertime. And black bile, phlegm, and blood all worked similarly in different types of seasons and produced a different effect within the body. But the point is if you had all of these things in balance, then you yourself were in balance and you had a pretty good life that you could be leading. So if anything's in balance, if you're too angry all the time, or if you're constantly sad and gloomy, or if you're just kind of going along going, yeah, I don't care, man, or if you're just excessively positive, then you have to have your bodily humors, quote unquote, balanced through this bloodletting. So doctors really aren't fixing very much during this era, given their understanding of the body. Other treatments that doctors used during this period involved things like amputation of limbs. If a person, for example, went outside and they cut their hand, they went outside and they were cutting tree branches down, and they happened to get scratched by a limb, and they wound up developing an infection on their hand, doctors would look at that, and rather than say, how can we treat the infection, they'd go, well, we got to cut that hand off before the infection spreads to the rest of the body and you lose your entire arm. So amputations were a common practice during this period. Doctors also performed lobotomies. People demonstrated elements of insanity. They would have lobotomies by drilling into the person's head, and these drills were essentially a hand drill where you just kind of cranked until the drill just went into the head, punctured the skin and everything, the skin and the skull. All of this stuff was done without the aid of anesthesia because anesthesia hadn't been created for these people yet. So the best one could hope, if they were getting some sort of surgery like this, the best they could hope is that the doctor had some alcohol that they could get good and lit up, and then they'd have their little surgery. Also, to give you an idea of how doctors understood the body, in addition to the humors, the system of humors like the Greek had, when it came to dealing with the limbs and body parts and stuff like that, and how do we know where to cut the hand off or where to cut the arm off, how do we know how to stave off infections, they had their standard medical textbook for teaching doctors about how the body worked was something called the Book of Martyrs. And I'm just going to read you the subtitle of this book here. The Book of Martyrs containing an account of the sufferings and death of the Protestants in the reign of Queen Mary I. So quite literally, the book that was used to teach doctors about how the body works, the book was actually quite literally a torture manual. So it's no wonder that doctors had a very strange understanding of the body. Doctors also, during this era, and this is particular to the bubonic plague, the situations that doctors engaged in, their plans to fix problems, frequently made situations worse. Doctors had the power, for example, when bubonic plague would hit a city, they had the power to order that dogs and cats would be exterminated. Now, this is problematic because bubonic plague spreads via a tick on a rat, on the rat population. So, in areas where you're going to have where people would have a large rat population, there's going to be an outbreak of the bubonic plague. Here, doctors are ordering the extermination of dogs and cats because they believed dogs and cats would kill rats and then take on the bubonic plague themselves and spread it throughout the population. It turned out, obviously, it's the opposite here. Dogs and cats were natural predators of these rats. So by killing off their natural predators, by exterminating their natural predators, it allowed the rat population in places like London to flourish and cause the bubonic plague to spread. So their solutions were not particularly good. Given this and their understanding of the quote-unquote humors of the body, it should not surprise you to know that the way doctors treated people tended to be more closely aligned with ideas like magic. People treated, doctors prescribed things like amulets and good luck charms as opposed to medicine. They did things like bleeding people out because they looked at this and said, happy people, people who are in balance, won't get sick. And if we put them back in balance, they'll be happy. So you give people these amulets and good luck charms to kind of stave off these sort of imbalances in their lives. Being a doctor is not a particularly big industry in England during this era. There were a grand total of approximately 38 doctors in all of England. We've identified 38 historians have identified 38 in multiple years throughout the 1600s, so that they're pretty comfortable with the idea that 38 is pretty much all there was. It might have fluctuated a little bit from year to year, but 38 is the average. When people wanted to talk about medical care, since they didn't go to doctors, they had to go somewhere. They had to seek medical help somewhere. And where people frequently turned was, as many people do, they turned closer to home. They turned to barbers. They turned to apothecaries. They relied, especially when it came to childbirth, they relied on apothecaries. They relied on midwives. And this was also a particular problem during Shakespeare's lifetime, this reliance on midwives. During Shakespeare's lifetime, 95% of births took place in the home as opposed to taking place in a hospital or a doctor's office or some sort of birthing center, whatever we use today. Totally different during Shakespeare's lifetime. Most people relied on one of these midwives. Now, reliance on midwives is not the problem. It's how the midwives worked during this era. Since there is a distinct lack of medical knowledge and a distinct lack of how infectious diseases work and how they spread and the like, midwives were frequently used not only for human births, but they were also used for the birth of livestock on these people's farms. So if a person had a horse or a cow that was about to give birth, and they happened to have a farmer happened to have his wife also pregnant and ready to give birth, it was not uncommon for a person to get in touch with a midwife. That midwife would come out and take care of the livestock first, and then come in and take care of that particular farmer's wife. And since they don't know much about hygiene during this era, since they don't have the same standards for cleanliness, it should not surprise you to find out that infections and death due to childbirth, again, spread like wildfire throughout the English population. Treatment for the mentally ill in England was even worse than stuff like this. The mentally ill were frequently stripped and locked in cellars. There were no real asylums, quote unquote, in England. There was a grand total of one for the entire country. And the name of this asylum was Bedlam. At Bedlam, the conditions were so bad that Bedlam became our modern word for chaos. The root, when people talk about something being chaotic and say, oh, it was Bedlam, their reference point is this mental health facility in England dating to the 1600s, because it was chaotic at this place. It was chaotic within this facility. There was some sense at Bedlam that people could be cured of mental illness with the right treatment if they were in the right environment and got the right treatment. However, if a person were actually sent to Bedlam, they were given 1 year to get better. If they were not, quote, cured of their mental illness, they were simply released to their family or kicked out of Bedlam if a family member didn't show up to claim them. So treatment for mentally ill was not exactly great during Shakespeare's lifetime either. But the one thing that England was more susceptible to than virtually anything else within English society, that thing that they're susceptible to is fire. Fire is a massive problem for the entire English society. The average everyday person in England and the royal family and nobility alike also suffered because of fires. To give you an idea of how bad this problem was, part of the problem resided in the construction of English cottages. In the previous lecture, I talked about the construction of English cottages by stacking things on top of one another, stacking building material on top of one another. Every single cottage, they may not have had porches back home in England, but every single cottage did have a fireplace. Now, while everything else is generally made of stone or bricks or rocks being piled up on one another, the average English person's chimney was actually made out of wood. So it's problematic. If they get that fire going too good, if it's going up, flames are going up too high, it's literally going to set the chimney on fire. Also, on top of all of that, the favored method for cleaning out a chimney, if you have never owned a fireplace, all of the stuff that gets burned down in the fire pit goes up the chimney and creates a buildup, requiring it to be cleaned every now and then. When they cleaned these chimneys, the typical method was to take a musket, push the musket up the chimney, and then fire the musket. So quite literally, their method for cleaning was to send an explosion up that chimney, basically knock everything down. The problem is that every now and then, by doing that, it also caused all of that stuff to catch on fire, and of course it would destroy the home, and in even worse cases, it would destroy more than the home. For example, in 1565, courtesy of this cleaning method, 50 houses in London were destroyed in a massive fire. In 1666, London caught fire, the so-called Great Fire of London. And when this happens, 100,000 people in London are actually left homeless as a courtesy of this fire. And part of why so many people are left homeless, part of why so many houses get destroyed, is because there was nothing these people could do to actually put out the fire. Now, they did have what were called fire brigades, if you will, groups of people who were supposed to go out and fight the fire, but their method for fighting fire was literally the same as it had been in the year zero of the Common Era. You have a line of people that lines up all the way down to a water source, and then they take buckets, fill them up with water, and pass it up one line and then down another line so that there's constant refilling of buckets and constant buckets coming up. But the problem is, if you've got a big house fire and you just dump a bucket of water on it, it's not going to work out. It's not going to end that fire. So they just didn't have a way to stop it. Now, if it had been a small number of homes and a small number of people who were left homeless during the Great Fire, London might have recovered fairly quickly from this fire. However, as it is, 97 churches were destroyed because of this fire. And churches were where people turned to for help when you had a disaster like this. The church would actually go and collect money, donations from their parishioners. These donations were called alms, A-L-M-S. They'd collect alms and then they'd distribute them to people in need or people who were impoverished. But when you've got 97 churches destroyed, it's not the people that they're going to be worried about. These churches are worrying about building themselves back up and picking themselves back up, as opposed to the actual congregation, the citizens who lived in that city. It left a huge swath of homelessness throughout England. And as you might note from some of the pictures on the bottom section of this slide here, even the king wasn't immune from all of this stuff. The images that are at the bottom of the slide are from a castle that was called the White Castle at the time. And the reason it was called the White Castle was because the building materials reflected white at such a rate that it appeared that it was built out of a gleaming white substance as opposed to being built out of stone. When this fire actually happens in 1675, it started by one of the silliest scenarios a person could imagine. A washerwoman who was in charge of cleaning the royal family's laundry had basically done all of their laundry. She'd put this boiling cauldron out and put all the laundry in it, and swished it around, and then hung it out to dry. Now, the drying was taking too long, so to speed the process along, the washerwoman built a fire underneath it. Now, it's solid logic that adding heat to this will dry the clothes off quickly, but it's also unsolid, kind of fragile here, because if you just leave it alone, if you're not paying attention to the fire, the clothes are going to dry out, and then the flames are going to whip up into the laundry and catch the laundry on fire, which it did in this case, and that fire wound up destroying the house. So everything is going poorly for people in England during this time. They've got bubonic plague all around them. They are unbelievably susceptible to fire. So they're looking for answers. They want answers. They want some sort of help. And who they turned to when their situation was so desperate, they didn't turn to politics. They didn't turn to reform. They didn't demand that the king do something about this stuff. They didn't get together and say, well, if the king won't do something, then by God, we're going to do something. No, instead, what these people did, they turned to alcohol as their solution for all of this, their way to sort of, again, self-medicate, if you will. And the amount of alcohol that people were drinking during this era in England was simply staggering. There's never, there's no point in American history or anything connected to American history where people are drinking this much alcohol. Sailors, for example, received as part of their rations, they received a gallon of beer every single day. Now, a gallon of beer may not sound very, very big to some people. It may sound like, well, that's Friday night before everybody goes out. It's only 64 ounces, or excuse me, 128 ounces. But a gallon of beer every single day is going to have dramatic effects on the person who's actually consuming it. So why are they drinking this alcohol? Why are they getting this much? Well, it's the necessary narcotic for these people's lives. Everything is terrible around them. Everything's ugly around them, and they are drinking to cope with all of this stuff. So just like when we talked about indigenous peoples a couple of classes ago, and talked about their alcohol consumption as a mode of self-medication, no different here. There's a use of alcohol for self-medicating purposes, and on top of that, it should not surprise you to know that many people in England were drunk virtually all of the time, to some level. Some more drunk than others, some maybe just a little what we might call tipsy. But either way, these people are drinking a staggering amount of alcohol during this era. Another essential, quote, narcotic, if you will, that was used by people here is the use of tobacco. Tobacco use in England became incredibly popular during the time, during Shakespeare's lifetime. It was an unbelievably popular product. Lots of England's people actually smoked it. But King James II becomes monarch during this era, and King James II had a real problem with tobacco. He did not like tobacco. In fact, he called tobacco, quote, the stinking weed. So he tried to outlaw it, actually. But he realized it wasn't going to work. Outlawing tobacco was not going to work. The people simply wanted it too much. So what James did was James settled for actually taxing tobacco at very high rates, as opposed to simply saying, well, these people live crappy lives, let's let them have whatever they want. So tobacco is considered a narcotic on some level, but it's used to try to keep these people down rather than to try to lift them out of poverty. Now, another discussion that these people are having, or excuse me, another distraction they have, I shouldn't have moved the slide ahead there. Another distraction they have is the distraction of gambling. People gambled on all sorts of things during Shakespeare's lifetime in England. And when I say they gambled on things, they gambled on everything. People would work in a cow pasture all day, for example, and they'd bet on which cow does a horsefly land, which cow is it going to land on. They would place bets on which cow would actually defecate first as they were watching. So when I say they're willing to bet on anything, they're willing to bet on virtually anything during this particular era, where the distractions are many for people in England. Now, later on, gambling is used as a distraction, and alcohol and tobacco are also supported by the royal family because their use, every single one of these things, their use by the populace helps stave off any idea about the politics of self-help. People aren't going to be worried about any ideas about self-help when they're, chasing their next drink, or they're chasing their next high, or if they're trying to chase a gambling debt down. They're simply not going to be able to engage in what we would today call the politics of self-help. Now, something else that's interesting about this is if we look at the modern era, if we think about what happens in the 21st century, gambling and alcohol consumption are among the habits that middle-class reformers are themselves going to try to break people of. So we see something happening here that's very much unlike the modern era. People in the modern era attack gambling and alcohol use, say that it contributes to poverty. Here, the ruling class supports gambling and tobacco use and alcohol use because it keeps the populace down. It keeps them from reacting to all of this stuff in a way where they say, look, we're just going to go out and we're going to overthrow the wealthy. So these habits are here essentially to stay. Now, when these people did not turn to alcohol, tobacco, or gambling, there was something else they looked to provide them an element of help. And this thing, what they're turning to, is God and the magic touch, so to speak. And these two things are not distinct. Today, we might look at this and say somebody who believes in God probably does not believe in magic, and somebody who believes in magic probably doesn't really necessarily believe in God. And yet, during this particular era, God and magic are absolutely intertwined. Kings and queens, for example, were said to have the so-called royal touch. The thought was literally, if a royal touched someone, then that person would be cured of whatever ailment they actually has. So it's restorative on some level. Isaac Newton, who is best known for his studies on gravity, actually spent the bulk of his time, the bulk of his working days, studying to try to elucidate the book of Revelations, and try to calculate the size of Solomon's temple as a way of trying to restore connection and contact and direct communication with God. So these people are not using magic and religion and all of these things. They're not using them separately. These are part of an overall thing that these people are doing to try to make their lives better. Another person who was said to have a similar approach to Newton was a guy named Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle was the most renowned doctor and probably the most reputable doctor in all of England during this period. And what he spent most of his time working on, as opposed to developing cures for sicknesses or trying to find out how infections work, what Boyle spent most of his time doing was working on the quote curative properties of stewed earthworms. The curative properties of stewed earthworms. The dean of Oxford University made the bulk of his money by searching for buried treasure. And he claimed that he was getting the information. The dean of Oxford University wasn't doing that. That was the Lord of the Admiralty. The Lord of the Admiralty was searching for the buried treasure. And the Lord of the Admiralty claimed that he was getting the information on where this treasure was stored by pixie fairies. He was saying literally it's pixie fairies that are teaching him where to go and dig for this buried treasure. Now, magic and religion and mysticism are not separate things either. Okay, for example, we'll come back to that in just a second. The Anglican Church during this period performed exorcisms. They had holy water and miracle-working saints, confession boxes, all sorts of things that would make magic and mysticism seem similar to one another. There were holy relics that were said to have curative powers. All of this stuff worked in conjunction. The idea of magic and God all worked together in conjunction. The point, again, this is not a society that's like our society. It's not very much like ours. However, in England during the late 16th century, some things are about to start changing. There's going to be a change that allows the English to actually start thinking about putting colonies in the Americas. For one, it's the development of the idea of private property in England. Private property was tied to a process and to the development of capitalist agriculture. The reason this process develops, the reason this idea about capitalist agriculture develops, is through the process, the development of an idea called enclosure. Now, enclosure was something that was fueled by the massive increase in the price of real estate throughout England during the time. Property values were starting to go up and up, and there was a distinct interest in keeping land prices and land values low. Okay? Because these land values were so high, there's a phenomenon developing called enclosure. Okay? And we're going to define enclosure as a Missing a slide here. Got to go to the right one here. This economic system is called mercantilism, but the phenomena that pushes it is enclosure. Enclosure is the appropriation or seizure of traditional common lands by a small class of landlords. Now, common lands were areas where anybody could grow a crop. There would be this big common area out on in a peasant village, and on that common land, they would divide it up into individual little slots, and each person could grow a crop, or they could raise livestock on it, and then in turn, they would when they would shear their sheep, or they'd process their wheat, whatever, they would turn over a portion of that to the lord of the manor, and the lord of the manor would effectively protect them in return for all of this stuff that they're giving him. Well, by the time the late 1500s rolled around, since land values were going up, what landlords did, what these nobility started doing, was they would go out to the common lands and they'd fence them off, and then they'd tell all of the peasants who lived there, you don't get to live here anymore, because their thought was, we're going to take over all of this land, we will grow a cash crop, or we will raise livestock on it, and the only peasants we don't need a bunch of peasants working this area, all we need are enough to actually take care of the animals and to take care of the crops. We don't need to employ everybody here, so we're not going to employ everybody. So fencing them off and using it for livestock or for the growth of a cash crop wound up causing a distinct shortage of land and wound up causing land values to go up and up and up. Now, over the process of this seizure of these common lands, the English nobility only took about 5% of the available land in England. They seized about 5% of the land, which doesn't sound like much. But if you consider in the United States, for example, that 80% of the United States population, even today, 80% of our population lives on 4%. If you consider that idea, then the issue here is if you seize the right 5%, you can really have something amazing back home in England. You can really have something flourishing. So fencing off this stuff and using it for livestock raising, kicking peasants off of this land, because once you don't need them, you also don't want them living there on the land either. So these landlords kick these peasants off of this land, and now everything seems to be working out for the ruling class in this process. Peasants have two basic options at this point. Peasants can leave and go to the cities and work as wage earners, or they could live in the woods as criminals. And essentially, this idea of living in the woods as criminals, it doesn't matter which version of it you've seen. If you've ever seen Robin Hood, that's precisely what's going on. The people who are living in those woods, the people who are, quote, killing the king's deer and that sort of stuff, these are people who were victims of the issue of enclosure. They had lost their farm lands, they had lost the common lands and the place that they lived by virtue of this eviction, courtesy of enclosure. So they could live in the woods as criminals, or they could go off and be wage earners. Now, while many did actually engage in wage earning, a large number of people turned to living in the woods as criminals. So that should tell you something about how viable the idea of going off to the city and getting a job, how viable that actually was. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is the definition of the new economic system that enclosure is part of. Enclosure was part of a broader system of economic change in England during this period, and that economic change for England was called mercantilism. Now, we're going to have a very specific definition of mercantilism, so this is very important. It's very important that you pay attention, because this is the definition of mercantilism that we're going to use. It's not going to be the definition of mercantilism that you might find on Wikipedia or that you might find in our textbook, American Yawp. It's not going to be something that you might read off of some other website. We have a very specific definition of mercantilism that we're going to use for this course. Mercantilism is an economic policy that emphasizes the direction of all economic activities by the government in order to maximize the country's economic well-being, as opposed to worrying about private profits. So it's not what we call, it would not be what we call primitive capitalism in any way, shape, or form, because capitalism focuses on the individual's economic well-being as opposed to the country's well-being. Mercantilism focuses on the country's economic well-being. So it's not primitive capitalism. It's also very much state control oriented. The state determines who's involved in what industries. The state determines what industries actually exist. The state determines price. The state determines output. The state determines virtually every part of the process. So by virtue of this type of state control, as opposed to individual control, once again, it's not capitalism. It's closer to the exact opposite of capitalism. And then the other thing we need to know about mercantilism is that mercantilism promotes the interests of the nobility. The nobility have a very distinct set of interests, and those interests are threefold. What the nobility wants more than anything else is to, one, put the poor to work to enhance the state's wealth. After all, mercantilism is about all economic activities being directed by the state in order for the state to benefit from that economic activity. So putting the poor to work to enhance the state's wealth is a critical part of mercantilism. And secondly, not three, there's two. Secondly, the interests of the nobility are to keep the poor from revolting. The poor know that this system is rigged against them. The poor know that there's virtually no way for them to rise up under mercantilism. So in addition to making sure that the state maintains its position in terms of wealth, it also has to make sure that the poor don't wind up rebelling, that they don't just say, the hell with this, we're not doing this anymore. So the nobility passes laws to achieve this. And in general, what the nobility is able to do is they're able to outlaw begging in the process of these new laws. They regulate wages. They wind up also controlling the movement of people, and they establish a system of alms. Now, none of this should sound familiar to you in the modern world, because virtually no one actually engages in this type of an economic endeavor. Okay, we don't have a system in general where begging is outlawed, where there's a distinct regulation of wages. And while we do have some wage regulation, the wage regulation is in terms of letting it spiral out of control. It's about making sure that wages are actually kept low. And we also are seeing people being told they can't move. If they want to move, they're being told, no, you can't move. You can't go out and chase a higher paying job just because you think it will benefit you, because it's not necessarily going to benefit the state. And then, of course, rather than having some sort of publicly funded assistance, there's going to be a system of charitable giving that's done by the actual government. Now, some of the laws that they pass in order to do this, to enforce these type of interests, in 1653, the British are going to, or the English are going to pass a law that requires everyone in England, the average everyday citizen, to work from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. That's a massively long day. That is a 15-hour work day. All are going to be required to work from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. with time left for these people, time out for eating, drinking, and rest. And that time out for eating, drinking, and rest was limited to 2 hours. Okay? So by and large, people are going to be working 13-hour days. That's the law anyway. Now, the reason it's passed and the reason they're able to, the nobility looks at this and says, this is a great idea, is if people are working for 13 hours a day, they're on a consistent basis. If they're working 13 hours a day, they're going to be too tired to come home and march in a protest. They're going to be too tired to come home and write out some philosophical diatribe about what's going wrong in society. So keep these people busy, keep them working, and keep them down where they actually are. Now, the problem with this is there's a couple of big issues. The first is, I told you already, England has chronic unemployment. So there simply are not enough jobs to actually go around. So even if a person wanted to obey the law, chances were they were going to run afoul of the law just by virtue of being unable to find a job. Another big point of this law of 1563 is that the nobility are actually exempted from it. And here's why the nobility are exempted from it. There's a phrase used to describe the nobility. The nobility are men of gentle means. They're ladies and men of gentle means. Now, men of gentle means, what does that mean? Men of gentle means is kind of compressed into something called a gentleman. So the nobility are gentlemen. And there's one thing that everybody knows about, quote, men of gentle means. They are not artisans. They do not work with their hands. They don't engage in labor. So whether it's what we would call, quote unquote, white collar labor today, or whether it's blue collar labor, what we would call blue collar labor, the nobility are exempted from that because they do not work ever. Okay, even in a circumstance where they've got nobody to go out and plant their seeds. If they've got seeds and say, I want to grow corn over here, these people don't go out and plant it themselves. They pay for people to do that, not much, but they pay for it. But these people are not physically going to do it because they are men of gentle means. So that's another problem. And then another problem is a situation that makes that unemployment problem even worse. At one point in this Shakespearean era, the population increases by 50%, so that unemployment crisis becomes even worse. It becomes more pronounced by the time we're headed into the 1600s. So England's next gamble is to try to guarantee a job to everyone by work rationing. And the way this works is that every single person in England is going to be guaranteed a job. Doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter how good or bad you are, you're always going to have a job. Now, these jobs tended to be apprenticeships more than anything. And an apprenticeship, especially during this era, an apprentice is actually, quote, paid in knowledge. They're not paid in actual funds. So these people are not moving into the workforce over money. That's a problem. We also see this in how the jobs are created. Each person has to serve a 7-year apprenticeship. They're not necessarily working for wages. They're working for knowledge. So they have to serve a 7-year apprenticeship. They have to be 30 years of age in order to actually practice a trade. So to move out of the apprenticeship, they have to be 30 years of age. And a reminder, the life expectancy of this era was 29. And they had to be married. So these people had real problems getting jobs. The work rationing caused a real problem. So people didn't have jobs, but they were still out there doing work. They also, England creates what are called workhouses during this era. They establish workhouses so that people who didn't meet these standards of serving a 7-year apprenticeship or couldn't find an apprenticeship or had served their apprenticeship but weren't 30 years of age and couldn't practice a trade but couldn't return to their apprenticeship, these people would be established or sent off to workhouses. And what people did in the workhouses, as the name implies, is they worked. But again, they're not working for wages. They're working for food and shelter. And people who were assigned to a workhouse worked 7 days a week. They didn't get a day off. They worked 7 days a week. England tried contract labor. They tried the idea of having all workers sign labor contracts. The labor contracts were required to be 1 year in duration, and the reason for that is they thought that if everybody knows that they're going to lose their job the next year, or could lose their job the next year, it's going to force them to work harder and harder and harder to keep the job that they actually have. It turned out, again, it didn't work. The people who tended to skip out on the contracts were actually the employers, not the laborers. And when these people who were laborers wound up losing their contract, if somebody skipped out on the contract, if an employer skipped out on the contract, the employer would be punished, to be sure, but the laborer had nowhere to go. So what would happen to them? They'd be assigned to a workhouse. So the circumstance got even worse for them. By 1697, things are really bad in England when it comes to the impoverished people there. They start designating their poor or marking their poor in a very distinct way. People who were poor were required to wear on their left shoulder a blue P that stood for pauper. So they're marking their lowest class in England by saying these people are wearing blue. Now, think about that in contrast. Once you've watched Lecture 2 on slavery in the New World, they're doing the same sort of thing. They're marking their labor class in the Americas in a very distinct way too. They're using race as a way to mark their laboring class. In England, they're using that blue P. Now, why they're not doing things like paying greater wages, why they're not going, hey, here's more money. If you've got more money, you'll spend more money, and it'll create this cycle within the economy. The reason is these people just don't believe that that's how it works. The goal is to make these people contribute to society, to contribute to the government's well-being, not to raise them out of poverty. In the 1700s, people in England who were among the nobility, believed this was the best way to do it. One of their own wrote in his diary, quote, "Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor or they will never be industrious." Now, those are the changes. As bad as this system sounds, I want to emphasize here, as bad as this system sounds, it meant that money was constantly coming in to the nobility. Money was constantly coming in to the royal family. So it did create a massive amount of wealth, but only for one class. Okay, and this is potentially a disaster. In the short term, right now, it's benefiting the ruling class, but in the long term, it's got real potential problems. And one of these upper-class English people recognized this, and this person's name was Adam Smith. Adam Smith was an economist who wrote a book that got published in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argued that there are two competing economic philosophies in this world, and he named those those competing economic philosophies. We call this the one system mercantilism today because Adam Smith named it mercantilism. But he says the two systems are mercantilism and capitalism. And he says in mercantilism, which he called a, quote, recipe for disaster, he said the government gets involved directly in the economy and they tell people where they can work. They create government-sponsored monopolies in certain industries. They engage in this job rationing. They fix prices. They fix wages. They don't allow a sort of free market to exist. Now, Smith believed a free market existed out there, that if the government kept their hands out of it and let every person pursue their own economic self-interest, i.e. do what is best for you as opposed to doing what's best for the economic health of the government, then everybody is going to benefit. By virtue of you doing what's best for you, it will create more wealth, it will create more tax revenue, and the government will obviously be secure because they will be getting tax money from the individual, as opposed to just saying, well, individuals can't earn more than this, and every penny beyond that belongs to the government. Okay? He said everybody is going to benefit from this. We'll have more jobs, we'll have a bigger marketplace. This is why what he talked about in terms of creating, quote, the invisible hand of the marketplace. And what he called this system was capitalism. He said this is the system. Government stays out, lets the invisible hand guide the marketplace. Supply and demand will do all of this stuff, and everyone will benefit. Now, this comes out in 1776, which is a remarkable coincidence. And a lot of historians don't believe in coincidences. And in this particular case, I'm one of them who doesn't believe in the, quote, coincidence of the wealth of nations and the American Revolution. And the reason I don't believe in a coincidence here is because Adam Smith, in Part of the Wealth of Nations, talks about how these two competing philosophies, these two competing economic philosophies work to the detriment of each other. They cannot coexist in a system. A country cannot be a little bit mercantilist and a little bit capitalist. And he says the problem here in England and within the English Empire, the British Empire as it's being called by this point, the problem in the British Empire is that the British government operates under the system of mercantilism. But they're allowing one of their groups of colonists, the colonists in the Americas, they're allowing them to operate almost as capitalists, but they're allowing some elements of capitalism while crushing other elements. He says, this can't work. It won't work. He said, Americans want to be capitalists. They want to do this sort of stuff. Smith argues England in general will benefit from capitalism. But this conflict between mercantilism and capitalism will ultimately result in a split between the colonists and the British Empire. And it turns out he was right. It just so happens that he was preparing this book and watching the economic situation in the Americas closely and saying this is going to cause a war. And it turns out he was absolutely right. So for the ramifications of that, in our next lecture, in Lecture 4, we're going to take a step back and see, once they've got the money to colonize, how do the British actually colonize in the Americas, and how does that colonization work, and what ultimately leads to the split between the British colonies and their quote, mother country, if you will, England. So, see you next time for Lecture 4.